Okay, so in this review of the state's role in regulation, we're going to start out with the executive branch. Now, the executive branch is led by the top executive, who at the state level is called the governor. And the governor plays a really pivotal role in setting priorities, right? So we know a lot of their powers, we're going to talk about it, but they really set where is all of this regulatory movement heading towards. So they'll set transportation priorities, set states priorities, particularly through executive orders. So they will order their state agencies to do certain things, and that's how they're going to set their priorities. So, for example, they set the transportation. One, if transportation is going to be a priority, and if it is, what about it, right? So, and this is an example you see here on the right, or the top right picture. That's Governor Newsom. He's the governor of California. In 2020, he signed an executive order saying that the state of California was going to phase out gasoline powered vehicles by 2035. And he mandated that all new passenger vehicles sold in California must be zero emission by that year. So that's an example of an executive order in the transportation. And now this is going to filter down to all of the agencies, and they're going to implement that rule in various ways, right? So the governor also proposes, budgets, going down to that third prong, budgets that allocate funding for those projects, for those transportation projects, right? So the legislature sets the funding, right? They tax and spend, but the governor often, and the governor will put together their own budget and send it to Congress for review. And they can choose to follow it or not, but they can propose it, and they can propose fundings at the levels needed to carry out these different priorities. So that's a power of the governor. And there in the middle, sorry, I'm going out of order a little bit, but the governor is going to appoint leaders to lead these state agencies, right? So state agencies, we'll talk a little bit more about them, but like Caltrans, which is the California Department of Transportation, the governor gets to pick who's going to head that up. So obviously they're going to choose someone who will follow their priorities, whether they're written, if they're written in an executive order, they have the force of law. But you don't have to write them down. You can just pick someone that either shares your priorities or agrees to follow your priorities. And as they, hire within the agency, or the agency sets its agendas and goals for the year, they're going to really feed off of those priorities of the governor. So I started with the governor, the top of the executive branch. But if we zoom out and look at the executive branch as a whole, it, led by the governor, is responsible for executing and enforcing regulations throughout the state, right? Via their state agencies. So Congress is going to pass laws that need to be followed. The governor is going to have their own priorities, and it's up to these state agencies to interpret those, or take those laws, take those priorities, and turn them into specific rules that someone can follow. And we'll talk more about that. That still sounds very, high level. We'll talk about like what is an example of a regulation. But let's take a look at what kinds of state agencies exist, specifically in the transportation world. So we have CARB, the California Air Resources Board. That's a really important one that we'll talk a lot about, but they enforce emission standards for vehicles. So this is really critical in the state's climate change policies. So that executive order we just discussed, where vehicles have to be zero emissions by 2035, without further specific rules, what is that? How do we comply with that? And, what is that going to look like? It's up to CARB to figure out how to make that happen. What are the rules they need to make that happen? I mentioned Caltrans already. That is the California Department of Transportation. So they're going to oversee the state's network of highways, roads, and bridges. And they're going to be the one that implement infrastructure projects for like road repair improvements. So for example, with automated vehicles, they are usually connected. We see V2X connections. To the extent that we need additional infrastructure on the highways, it would be Caltrans who would make that a priority, right? So that's an example of an agency that has a lot of relevance to what we're talking about here. And then a third example we have is the California Public Utilities Commission. Um, they will regulate what we call TNCs, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, ride sharing, and they're going to ensure the safety standards for public transport. So robo taxis are going to deal with California Public Utilities Commission, quite a bit because that has come under their purview. So those are examples of state agencies. We'll look at them in more detail, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about agencies and exactly what they're doing. So obviously, their job as agencies is rulemaking. They draft regulations. They take public comments and they do the final adoption. So agencies like CARB or Caltrans are going to develop regulations that implement transportation related laws passed by the legislature. An example is that CARB drafts rules to reduce vehicle emissions by setting standards for fuel types and fuel efficiency, right? So those standards for fuel types, levels that they must meet are going to be, set by CARB. So, and when it comes to rules, making rules, the process is a little similar to that of the federal government. If you haven't seen that lecture yet, or if it's been a while, we start out with a notice of proposed rulemaking. The agency says, hey, we're going to make some rules in this area, and it puts the public on notice that this is going to happen. So this happens after the regulation is already drafted. They come with a draft, so we have something to respond to, the public. Sometimes they don't have to, but sometimes they will say before they start creating a draft that they're going to do this. And we saw this with some federal agencies. They'll put out questions that they would like answered, and individuals or companies can answer those questions to give the agency some factual information to go off of as they draft their first draft of the rule. So we have the notice of proposed rulemaking. Once the rule is drafted, it's published for public comment. An example of this was CARB's with those proposed emission reduction targets. They want input from stakeholders like auto industry or environmental groups. It's really helpful to know if the auto industry is like, this is literally impossible, and here are the reasons it's impossible. Or if the environmental groups aren't happy with it, this doesn't go far enough. Here are some things that we don't like about this. They can get that feedback before the rule actually goes into enforcement. And then finally, once they've gotten the feedback and they adjust the rule, because the goal here is to make a rule people could comply with. No one wants a overly burdensome rule. The point is we want people to be able to comply with the rule. So once they get the feedback, they usually will adjust what they've written with the new things that they've learned. But once that public comment closes and the adjustments are made, the regulation is adopted, and now we go into enforcement. So sticking with emissions, CARB would put out the emission standards, what standards that automakers need to meet, emission standards once you purchase the vehicle, maintaining your vehicle to make sure that it stays within those emission standards. And so, for example, a way they enforce this is they set up the truck checks, right? These large trucking these large trucks have to stop and have their emissions measured to make sure they're still in compliance, and if they're not, they can be fined or taken off the road. But that's an example of very specifically what an agency might do in order to meet in order to implement implement a law or an executive order. So in this case, the governor sets an executive order saying, I want emissions lowered, I want them 0 by this date, and I want them lowered over time. CARB will set the actual standards. Maybe they'll taper them down over time so that people can adjust. And then they will check. They will actually check the vehicles at the time of sale, or ask for self-certification. And then they'll have, the clean truck check. They'll have these checkpoints set up on the side of the road where trucks have to, by law, go in and get their emissions tested. And if they're not where they need to be, they need to fix it. And if they, continuously violate, they can get fined or lose their license, things like that. So that's an example of taking a priority of the executive, the governor, or if it happened to be a law that was passed, and going through the rulemaking process all the way down to enforcement. So that, in a nutshell, is the executive branch. Now let's turn to the legislative branch.